Hey everyone, shapes and shadows today. Simple little composition of rectangles, triangles, and a couple of trees. This is a 6x9 sheet of Arch 140-pound cold pressed paper. Now I'm starting out by wetting the sky with my 3/4 inch flat brush, being somewhat careful to paint around the structures and around the trees. So I flip my board upside down and I'm going in with cadmium yellow at the horizon and adding water to the bead as it works its way to the top of the page, or in this case, the bottom of the page. I want the sky to fade towards the top. And with it still wet, now I can add in my cadmium orange at the horizon. Same thing, adding a bit of water to the bead and just softening the edge and let it fade towards the top of the sky. Now with the edges all cleaned up, I'll flip it around and I'm going to put a tree line in the back, so I'm just mopping out some of the orange from the horizon and clean up the sky a bit, of course. There we go. Now for the tree line, I'm wetting the area where I want my trees, and I'm going to have a hard edge on them this time because they're a little bit closer to the house. So I'm using the wet area, dropping in wet, dropping in some carbazole violet, and which is a purple, and some ultramarine. And at the base of that stand of trees, I'll just lift out a little bit of the color just to provide some atmosphere and push them back just a bit. Now my foreground, I got a 12 round loaded up with yellow ochre, creating a nice wet mixture. And now I'm dropping in some burnt sienna and a really rich mixture of sap green and letting it create some grassy textures in there with horizontal strokes. I want the attention at the front door, or at least on the building, so I mopped out a bit at the top of the hill. Now with it dry, I'm going in and put a stone wall in right behind the house. So that's a combination of Payne's Gray and ultramarine and a bit of burnt sienna. I want to make it a bit darker because right now it's looking an awful lot like the trees in the background. I mentioned I wanted the highlight to be the house or the front door. So here I'm just darkening the foreground. I'm going to do the foreground in layers, as you can see. And there I'm just adding in a bit more sap green and just darkening the immediate foreground. And with it wet, got the fan brush with some indigo and sap green and trying to drop in some grass textures. And there's a bit of burnt sienna just to make it a little more interesting. With everything dry, I can now add a little more color to the stone wall right behind the house. And now we can get around to putting some color in those roofs. So this is quinacridone gold, and I'm doing a wet and wet application. So I'm filling the entire roof with the gold, and then add in some other colors to give it some texture. So both these roofs, I didn't want to do a whole lot of inking in this painting, so I've decided to make it like a tin or copper type roof. That way I can keep the inking to a minimum. So with this wet and wet application, I've got the quinacridone gold, and I'm dropping in burnt sienna. And at the base of the roof, right down near the eaves trough, I'm putting in the dirty bits, which is some Payne's Gray and burnt sienna and a little bit of purple. So my neighbor's house, just over the hill, a little bit in the distance. So I started out with some pale yellow and then dropped in some sap green. So it's a wet and wet. Not a whole lot of detail because it is a little bit further back. And with that dry, I can move over and paint this rather thin chimney with a combination of Payne's Gray and burnt sienna. Now my trees, I wanted them to be of similar color to the foreground. I wanted them fairly dark, up against that nice light sky. So I went in with pale yellow, cadmium pale yellow hue, really wet mixture, mixed in some of the yellow ochre from the foreground, and then some really intense sap green. Now my light will be coming from the left in this painting, so I wanted to keep the upper left side of the foliage a little bit lighter. Here I'm putting in some indigo for the dark underside of the foliage. And I'm just dropping in a bit of water, create a bit of a back run, and throw some salt at it and see where it goes. So with that drying, I can add a few little details to the neighbor's house. Drop the shadow in. Well, I got the Lamy Safari, that's an extra fine nib. I got that out and I was just detailing out the edge of the house where it butts up against that tree. And while I was at it, I decided I'd finish the neighbor's house and get the right side cleaned up. Now, with the right tree painted, it's pretty easy to do the one on the left. I'm doing the exact same technique. Seeing as the one on the right worked out, I can just go in here with the pale yellow hue, really wet mix, to establish where the foliage is, and then just drop in my oranges and yellow ochre, and here the indigo for the dark underside of the foliage. And again, hit it with some water and throw some salt at it. Now I had a nice bead underneath the foliage, so I got my rigger brush out, and rather than mop up the bead, I'm going to drag it down and create the trunk for my tree. So I do the trunk of the tree. It's a wet and wet, so I'm dragging the paint down and then adding other colors to the wet mix. So there's some burnt sienna and some Payne's gray. And that trunk will be a little bit darker than the one on the tree to the right, which is a bit further back. So here there's more of a burnt sienna. Again, I'm using a rigger brush to draw it out. And it's more of a burnt sienna, more of a reddy brown look because the light is hitting it back there. And I can mop out a bit from the one on the back too, just to keep it a bit further back. So with my tree trunks drawing, I've gone in with the ink and start to establish the roofs and the dormer. I mentioned earlier that I was going to have a tin or metal type roof, metal or copper. I've got it inked in with vertical lines. And once I applied the ink to it and saw what my roof was going to look like, I realized it's going to need a little more texture. So I'll get all the lines in place, and the seams there where the panels meet, I'm going to add a bit of color. Now I promoted this as a shapes and shadows painting, and here come the shadows. That's an ultramarine. My light's coming from the left, so the shadows be over to the right. So that's almost a straight up ultramarine color. Nice rich ultramarine. And just dropping it in where that roof's throwing shadow, the dormer is going to throw some shadow to the right. And of course under all the eavesdrops. And here's what I was talking about as far as adding a little more texture to the roof right at the seams. I just wet those areas and dropped in some burnt sienna and some grays. And once I had the shadows in place, I realized the roof needed a little more work, so I'm adding some darker stuff down near the eaves trough. And that's giving the whole roof, that's giving the whole painting some depth. And here's what I started out with earlier, having a dark foreground leading you up to the doorway. So here, that's an undersea green with some indigo. So nice dark foreground, and I'm using the fan brush to soften the edges and give it a grassy type look. And here are the last little bits. I'm just going to do a quick trace around the trees with the pen, get it signed, get the tape off it. There you have it, simple little composition, some shapes and shadows. Thanks for dropping by, and we'll see you again soon.